I'd like to welcome all of you to this evening's Academy Town Square, preparing for a warmer, wetter Philadelphia. For those of you who haven't attended these in the past, Academy Town Squares bring together experts and the public for in-depth discussions of critical environmental and scientific issues. Tonight's program is being presented as part of the Academy and Drexel's Climate Year, where we are focusing our institutional resources throughout 2021 on understanding, communicating, and addressing the multiple challenges of climate change. As we mark Climate Year, I invite everyone to visit the Academy and experience our exhibition of Gideon Mendel's Drowning World, a riveting visual presentation that highlights the impact of flooding on people and communities around the globe. We're open now on Wednesdays to Sunday, and the Drowning World exhibit is part of your regular admission, so please do try to get by and take a look. Often when we see images like those in Drowning World with people experiencing climate disasters like flooding, we tend to think of climate as something far away or somewhere in the future. Events of the last few years and particularly now science have confirmed that climate change is happening here and now. It's also important to realize that different locations will experience climate change differently. Here in Philadelphia region, experts tell us that we're going to see more precipitation and more heat. In other words, it's going to get wetter and hotter. And I think today is probably a pretty good example of the wetter part. And as we're already seeing. Tonight, we're very pleased to have with us experts from 4 different sectors to discuss what climate change is doing to Philly, what it will do as time goes on, and what we can do about it. I'm going to introduce our panelists and then ask each of them to give some views on climate change from their respective fields. After that, our discussion will focus on your questions. So please feel free at any time to put your questions into chat or use I guess we just have chat. I don't think we have a QA feature, so just use chat. And then my colleagues, Mike Kazmarek and Sean Stallworth, give us a wave, guys. We'll be managing the chat and keeping an eye on the questions and posing them to me to give to the panelists. We'll try to get everyone's questions. We may run out of time. I'll combine some of them that are similar, and the order they get asked in will depend on how our discussion goes. Please be aware that tonight's program is being recorded, and it will be portions of it will be broadcast on NBC 10. So just we will be recording it also for the Academy, but tonight in particular, it's being recorded to be reshown on TV. So be aware. Let me start by introducing our panelists. Jasmine Velez is the Community Outreach Coordinator for Esperanza. Julia Rockwell, Manager of the Climate Change Adaptation Program for the Philadelphia Water Department. Dr. Mark Sabay here at the Academy is a Collection Manager of Fishes, and someone I think many of you already know that probably doesn't need to be introduced. And I'm sure many like myself have watched for years. We're pleased to have with us tonight Glenn Hurricane Schwartz, meteorologist for NBC 10's First Alert weather team. And I think like many meteorologists in the region, Glenn has been very busy today. So we're very happy to have him with us. I'm going to start just posing quick questions to each of our panelists and giving them a little bit of time to talk. I think Glenn is going to use a few slides to highlight some of his answers. Let me just take it this way. Glenn, you've worked in weather forecasting for over 40 years. Can you give us some idea of how climate change also changes weather? Maybe we hear a little bit about what the distinction is between weather and climate, some examples of changes you've seen already, and what impacts we might expect of climate change.
All right, well, thanks for the invitation. And this subject is right up my alley. Weather forecasting, severe weather, extreme weather, and climate change, which is going to be the subject of a lot of my study for the future. The difference, basically, weather is what you get, climate is what you expect. So 20 years from now, I would expect July to have a lot of days that hit 90 degrees. But the weather varies from day to day during that July. So some days may only be 70. Some days may be 100. And so that's the difference. The climate is the overall average and how that changes over time. Let's show you some of the illustrations here. The first thing, I just want to give you an idea of how long I've been doing this. So we'll talk about climate change in the future in Philly. That is me on the right, believe it or not. 1972. I've been forecasting professionally since then. That was at AccuWeather. And yes, those are my pants. Next. And I started my TV career in 1979. So I've been around a long time. And I've been around in Philadelphia a long time, since 1995. And let me tell you, I've been here 26 years. I have never seen a severe weather day like we just have had. And when you see the damage tomorrow, you're going to understand this may be the worst tornado that we have seen in this area in history. Next. Well, you know that things have changed, and we can calculate how much it's changed. Just during my career, the winters have warmed by almost 5 degrees. That's an average of 5 degrees every single day. That's a tremendous difference. If you change it by a half degree, that's significant. Next. And the other big factor is the rain. Yeah, you look at total rainfall, but that's not what those of us looking at climate are mostly interested in. We're interested in the biggest rain events. You've seen the damage all over the world. Well, right here in Philadelphia, the rain on the wettest day each year has been going up. And over the last 10, 15 years, I think it's accelerating. Next. So we talk about climate change, and some people think that's just a forecast and computer models. This is actually happening. These are the things that were supposed to happen in theory, but they're already happening. The warmth, the measuring of the greenhouse gases, the glaciers retreating, the sea ice declining, the mean sea level rising, the ocean heat being recorded. Everything that has been expected is happening. Some cases happening faster than it's supposed to. Next. Winter storms. Why would you get winter storms in a warming climate? Well, you got a warmer ocean, you got more moisture. So when it's just cold enough to snow, you can get buried in snow. 3 of our 4 biggest snowstorms ever recorded in Philadelphia occurred this century. Next. And in general, this part of the country is getting the biggest changes in heavy precipitation, which of course includes today, more downpours. Next. So there's the record. I mean, it's obvious. We've been keeping records of Philadelphia since around 1880 or so. And these things are changing not only over time, but if you take a look at, let's say, the last half of that graph, it's even a steeper rise in the downpours. This is with 3 inches or more. That's enough to cause flooding. Next. Yep. Since 2010, the wettest hour, the wettest day, the wettest month, the wettest year, all of those records have occurred in Philadelphia and in many other cities around the country. Next. And hurricanes, they're more intense. They've had more rainfall. They also move more slowly. So that leads to much more damage. Next. The Category 5 hurricanes, just since 2017. All of those that you see, that's not from 50 years ago. That's just the last few years. The warmer ocean, you get stronger storms. And this is one of those things that's happening faster than it's supposed to. Next. And it's not just the Category 5s. Remember Sandy? 2012. It wasn't necessarily the intensity of it. It was the way it moved. And it took a sharp left turn that we've never seen before. And the reason for it was in that upper right, blocking high pressure system up over Greenland. Why? all of that melting ice, it changes weather patterns. And my theory is that it changed the track of Sandy, and we would not have even been hit by Sandy if it wasn't for the melting ice. Next. Yeah, no left turns. We don't like left turns. That's the worst case scenario. Next. Yeah, that blocking high, that came because of the climate change. Now, it's not just the category 1 or 2 or even 3 hurricanes that are increasing. That's hard to determine. We don't have a long period of record. But the category 4s and 5s, there is no doubt. There's been an explosion of those stronger storms. Next. And it's not just hurricanes and rainstorms. We're talking about windstorms. For example, the derecho back in 2012. These are long-lasting, severe storms that occur, that start generally with record-breaking heat on the edge of that, and then they move in our direction. And here we are today with probably the worst tornado or tornadoes that we've ever recorded in Philadelphia. Now, we won't be able to go back and say, yeah, climate change did this. But the derechos, that has a little more evidence. The hurricanes, more evidence than that. The floods and the heat waves and the droughts, no question about it.
Great, thanks, Glenn. I think thanks. It was a very sobering presentation there, but it certainly gives us a context for the discussion we're going to have now. I want to turn to my colleague, Mark Sabay. Mark, you're a scientist. You've been studying natural systems for many years, including rivers in South America, as well as in this continent. And we're going to let you be the defender of floods for a moment. I know, a lot of what we think about when we look at the disasters that flood causes or how bad they are, but floods are actually, in many cases, part of natural systems. They're important to aquatic life and ecological health. Tell us a little bit about why flooding isn't necessarily bad in itself, and why it's how people interact with floods that are really the problem.
Thanks, Roland, and good evening, everybody. Yeah, so flooding has been a natural part of landscapes all around the world for millennia. Floods are natural. In the springtime, increased rains in watersheds adds water to the system, and you have floods. I work primarily in the tropics of South America, and there the annual flood cycle is, everybody knows about it. The aquatic organisms know about it, and they depend upon it for their survival. So this annual flood pulse is the most important aspect and the most biologically productive feature of river ecosystems, especially large river ecosystems. Most people think of rivers as upstream to downstream, as kind of a linear system. But the flooding provides a transverse. Wow, okay. I just got a severe weather warning. How about that?
It's a tornado warning.
Well, I'm in the middle of the museum, so okay.
This was not planned, just so everyone knows. This is real.
Sure, National Weather Service, tornado warning until 7:30. So I should be all right in 15 minutes. Anyways, where was I? So flooding adds this lateral component to rivers. When the water rises, it floods, it moves out into the floodplain, and then it recharges wetlands, it recharges groundwater, and a lot of the aquatic organisms that live in the river, they move out onto the floodplain to feed and reproduce. So it's essential to the life cycle of a lot of organisms for this flooding to occur. And then as the floods recede, they bring those nutrients, those dissolved solids back into the system to again, kind of supercharge the organisms living in there. And you see these flood cycles in South America can be extremely dramatic, but they're essential to the natural wildlife. Now, of course, back in the day when developers looked at floodplains, they said, that's not a good place to build. They knew these areas would flood yearly, and so they avoided them. But as as development has increased and the need for land for development has increased, we encroach upon these floodplains, and there are consequences to that. A lot of developers, the idea now is to get the water out of the system as fast as possible and with as little flooding as possible. So that includes channelization, building dikes along the side of the river to keep that water flowing out as quickly as possible. And the removal of floodplains, it has severe consequences for the organisms that depend on this flood cycle, this annual flood pulse, to complete their life cycles. So, yep, that's just a different perspective. It's just a reminder that yes, floods cause a tremendous amount of damage and loss of human life. They can be severely disruptive to property and infrastructure, but there are organisms that depend on these flood cycles to complete their life cycles, and that's because they've evolved in these systems for millions of years.
Great, thanks, Mark. I think living as we do, or as we are in a river city where rivers are on either side of us, and you being right in the middle of a city that's about to possibly have an extreme weather event, we can look at both the natural cycles that you're talking about, but also for Julia, your job is to understand the risk to the physical infrastructure of Philadelphia. We just heard Mark's comments on natural flooding and their importance. But what happens when those processes affect urban settings, and how does urbanization change flood risks? What are the major challenges we face to the city's infrastructure, particularly as flooding and extreme weather events, as we just heard, are going to become more common?
Yeah, thank you, Roland, and hi, everyone. So I thought Mark's perspective was really interesting, and that's normally not how we think about flooding at the Philadelphia Water Department or in the city as a whole. So we kind of frame flooding in the context of where Philadelphia is located geographically, and also the fact that we have a highly urbanized city center. So Philadelphia, as many of you may know, is located at the bottom of the Delaware River watershed, which is over 13,000 square miles. So upstream factors and conditions do impact us in Philadelphia from upstream communities, so including flooding impacts. We are also located on the tidal Delaware and Schuylkill rivers, which means that we are vulnerable to coastal flooding impacts from storm surge and also sea level rise. And then, of course, we have many other creeks and streams and tributaries running throughout our city that make us vulnerable to riverine flooding in the non-tidal portion of those streams and creeks. So in terms of urbanization, what really happened, I'm going to take us back in time, is that we actually designed and built our sewer system in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And back then, city officials and engineers took really drastic measures to build out what is now our existing sewer system today that has over 3,700 miles of sewers. And they often used existing streams and creeks as the foundation for that drainage system. So a lot of historic creeks and streams have actually been encapsulated and are now serving as sewers that convey not just wastewater, but also stormwater during intense rainfall events. So as the city has become more urbanized, we have seen more land cover turn to impervious cover, which means that it can't infiltrate stormwater. That stormwater runs into our drainage system. And in areas of the city, especially where there are encapsulated creeks and streams, we see the sewer system get overwhelmed fairly quickly during intense rainfall events. So really there are multiple types of flooding we're dealing with: the coastal flooding, the riverine flooding, and then that drainage system capacity issue is what we refer to as infrastructure-based flooding or urban flooding. And climate change is really acting as a risk or threat multiplier when it comes to flooding. So as Glenn mentioned, we are already seeing more intense rainfall events. We are already experiencing sea level rise on the tidal Delaware River. And all of these impacts, unfortunately, are going to increase the frequency and severity of flooding impacts in Philadelphia. And I think it's important to bring things to the community level as well and think about the vulnerability of our residents and how with climate change, the effects that they already feel are being amplified. So when you have climate change interacting with pre-existing urban stressors, like areas of intense poverty or aging and deteriorating infrastructure, high population density, it's just creating conditions that we really need to address today. We can no longer, wait to plan for them. So in terms of working at the water department and working on infrastructure planning and design, I can say that infrastructure-based solutions are part of the approach we need to take to reduce our risk to flooding in Philadelphia. The Philadelphia Water Department is currently thinking about what combination of gray infrastructure, so things like tunnels and tanks, can be used along with green stormwater infrastructure that basically makes our land surface pervious again and allows stormwater to infiltrate. What combination of those types of infrastructure is going to be most effective at reducing our flooding risks? And in our climate change adaptation program, we are tasked with making sure that all of that planning and all of our infrastructure design is taking into account climate change projections, like more intense rainfall and higher sea levels and higher air temperatures. So I think I'll end on, I don't know how many minutes I used up already, but I'll end on the fact that, flooding is also not just a water department issue. Reducing our risks is going to really require broad citywide coordination. And it's because of that the city actually formed a citywide flood risk management task force in 2015 that currently consists of 15 city agencies as well as state and federal partners. It's why we hired our first floodplain manager in 2018. And more recently, the mayor also appointed a chief resiliency officer. So, we are taking steps to really improve our coordination as a city and also make sure that we're communicating with our communities regularly to really understand the risks and make sure their voices are heard and at the table when we're trying to identify solutions. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks, Julia. I think that was a point you made about the impact that flooding and overall climate change has on individuals and has on people. I think is really important and something we're probably going to return to here in a moment. I'd like to turn to Jasmine now. We've talked a lot about flooding and water and getting wetter, but also, there's really the issue of heat, and flooding is very dramatic and it also, people always see it and visible. But as climate change progresses, Philly's getting hotter also. And in fact, excessive heat is already a major problem in a lot of neighborhoods. And it's sometimes a less visible problem, although in some ways more devastating. Jasmine, you've been working in a neighborhood that has significant heat problems. And can you tell us a little what that looks like and what are the real impacts excessive heat are having on people's lives? What can we do to address some of these challenges? And maybe at some point, why are some neighborhoods so much hotter than others? And I just want to take it there.
Okay, thanks, Roland. And I'll just kind of say this. I'll start by saying that environmental issues are also social justice issues. And that really kind of speaks to Julia's point, I think, around just some of the issues some neighborhoods are facing. Low-income neighborhoods and communities of color are facing extreme heat as high as 22 degrees more than affluent communities. Or affluent neighborhoods. And so some of the common reasons why we're seeing extreme heat in other neighborhoods can include a lower tree canopy coverage, fewer green spaces, more exposure to things like asphalt and dark surfaces such as black roofs. In addition to that, as I mentioned, environmental issues are social justice issues. So we have to think about history of redlining and disinvestment that contributes to aging housing stocks. Even more, I think, pertinent now is when we think about even gentrification that's taking place in a lot of neighborhoods, thinking Hunting Park, Kensington, areas like Northern Liberties that have, completely gentrified as of recently, right? we're losing pertinent green spaces, including community gardens, or spaces where there may have already been an existing tree canopy being torn down for new builds. But I won't go too into that. What I'll say is that why is this important? When we think about heat, the real impacts of heat are increased risk of dehydration, heat exhaustion, heat stroke for all people, but particularly older Philadelphians, children, and of course, other sensitive populations. But we're seeing that, we think about this as an equity issue. Those who are being most affected are going to be communities of color and low income neighborhoods who don't have means to seek reprieve from the heat. So, I don't want to end it on a negative note or anything, but what I want to say is that, of course, we want to think about solutions. And Julia mentioned green storm water infrastructure as one of those potential things that we can increase in the community, in our communities, as well as, increasing green spaces, parks. And I particularly, I'm a big fan of expanding the tree canopies in our neighborhoods. And there's a lot of movement right now with the city, the Philly's urban forestry plan is really shifting into expanding tree canopy coverage in lots of neighborhoods. But with that said, we have to consider some of the issues that a lot of residents may be dealing with. So if we think about our city's infrastructure and our water line infrastructure, a lot of people have this myth, oh, I don't want a tree because it's going to get into my pipes, when in reality, the trees that are being planted now aren't the old trees that are really huge and would take over your sidewalk, right? But the real issue is roots are seeking water, and so they'll go into these older infrastructures that may be leaking and things of that nature, and it can create a lot of problems for folks who may not have the means to pay $3,000 for a new sidewalk to be replaced and things of that nature. So when I talk about all these amazing solutions, we also have to think about how can we work with the city to address some of these other things, such as, the sidewalk being affected, or how can we partner with the Philadelphia Water Department to think of other ways to, just consider how to reduce the heat in our neighborhoods. But yeah, I don't want to end it on a negative note. There's definitely lots of things that we're working at. At least in Hunting Park, we're working towards. This past year, we've planted over 150 trees in the neighborhood, and that's with permissions from owners. We've been working with Drexel University to create these really cool planter structures that help reduce heat in the neighborhood, have umbrella structures so that people can sit down outside and actually talk to their neighbors. And so there's lots of great things that are happening right now. But I just, I want to reiterate the importance of environmental issues being social justice issues as well.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. I think that's really important. And I think we get caught up in the sort of the engineering solutions to things, which are important, as Julia knows, but also recognize that there's such a strong human component to this and elements of human suffering. Like to thank you, Mike, for bringing the rest of the panel out here. And let's take a couple of questions. And please be sure to put your questions in chat or however you want to communicate them. Glenn, this was for you. You mentioned that the average amount of rainfall over the area is increasing. Is that consistent across this region, or are we seeing an uneven distribution? Some places have significantly more rain, where local places have less rain.
Well, there are local differences in different parts of this area, different parts of the Northeast. One of the biggest ingredients and causes of all of this is the Atlantic Ocean, just offshore. You got warmer ocean, you got more evaporation, you got more moisture. So anything near the ocean or affected by the ocean is going to see a bigger increase in rainfall. So I would suspect that the increase that we've seen in Philadelphia is very much like what we would see in Trenton or Wilmington or Atlantic City or Allentown. There wouldn't be that much different because we have that ocean so close, and the towns that are farther away from the ocean have higher elevation. So when you get a wind off the ocean and you get more upslope, you can get more rain there too. So it might actually even out. Anywhere in our area could get that kind of increase.
Great. a little different than the way heat can be sort of unevenly distributed at a finer scale, I think, than rain. I wanted to, while I was thinking about it, thank our panelists for everybody staying within their time frame. I so seldom happens when we do a panel discussion. So cheers for that. If we had the applause function, I'd use it. Howard Sherman, you have your hand up. Mike, you want to go ahead and unmute and let's hear the question.
Yeah, I put it in chat, but this is for Julia. First of all, how much has the level of the Delaware River increased in its tidal section? That's my first question. The second is, could you tell us more about the softer or gray interventions the water department is considering to ameliorate the expected increase in flooding?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for those questions, Howard. So we're actually lucky to have a really long record of Delaware River elevations in Philadelphia. They go back to around 1900, I believe. And off the top of my head, I think we've seen about a foot of sea level rise over that entire period of record to present day. So we do continue to track that data. And the tricky thing with sea level rise is that we just, we know it's the levels are going to continue to increase. We're just not sure on the timing and magnitude of those increases. So that can make things pretty challenging from the perspective of, infrastructure managers that have to plan and design infrastructure to have a very long, useful service life. But that's something our team is really trying to stay on top of with the science and just making sure we're really, wherever possible, using infrastructure approaches that are adaptive in nature. And I think that kind of gets to your green versus gray question. So I'm not sure what you meant by soft infrastructure. I guess I would categorize that as green infrastructure. Gray infrastructure is what we term as our traditional infrastructure, or what you would think of as like the pipes that are our drainage network, the tunnels we use to convey stormwater and wastewater, storage tanks that we build underground to hold water during intense rainfall events. Those are really, highly engineered solutions that are part of the approach we need to use to reduce flooding impacts. But a huge benefit of green stormwater infrastructure is that it is more adaptive in nature. So those systems are things like tree trenches or rain gardens, and they're small systems that are discrete and decentralized. So we implement them throughout the city, and we can change how they're planned and designed over time to accommodate climate change impacts. That is obviously much harder to do, or if not impossible, with something like a tunnel where you design it, you size it, you construct it, it's in the ground, and you can't really do much to change how it functions from there on out. So it's really a combination of those different types of infrastructure solutions that we need to pursue to address the flooding risks in our city.
Great. So I'm gonna pick a few more questions here out of chat. And again, as I say, I may not get them in the order, but we will try to get to everyone. Picking up on the discussion as far as green infrastructure, we had a question for Jasmine. Make sure I got it here. Shoot. I managed to lose it in the time that I was playing here. Oh yeah, we've got a person says, I'm super interested in urban forestry. Other than tree tenders, are there ways for citizens to get involved or to promote additional tree canopy?
Yeah, one of the ways right now, beyond the tree tenders program that's run by PHS, you can also, you're eligible to get yard trees through Tree Philly, who organizes events in the fall and the spring with local community organizations. At Esperanza, we usually host them in November and about April. So you can sign up for yard trees at those events in advance. As well as the city is working on the urban forest strategic plan right now. I know that they were doing pre-engagement for a while and trying to think of more solutions. So if you, I can actually link here to their page. where they're talking about the mission and some of the work that they've been really working on the last few years, or since 2019, I should say. But there's been an interactive map of the city's tree canopy, and just so we can really see where what neighborhoods really need to expand on the tree canopy. But yeah, besides Tree Philly and the Tree Tenders program, I would recommend also just planting as many native plants as you can in your own home, planter boxes. While, it's not going to reduce heat a lot, it's at least something that you can add in front of your home, beautify your space, and hopefully reduce some of that heat in front of your house. But yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Great. And we're getting a lot of questions here, so I'll try to get them in some kind of order. I want to go back to Glenn for a second. We had an interesting question. So when we have these extreme events, why don't weather reporters connect the dots to climate change for viewers? Glenn, that sounds like it's up your alley.
Yeah, it's it's a very complex subject, and we only have seconds to answer a question. And I would always find myself that you can't give an adequate scientific answer in 30 seconds. It can't be done. It used to be, up until maybe 5 years ago or so, where there was a reluctance of management in many parts of the country to have their weather people talk about climate because it was, quote, controversial. So our mission is to get as many viewers as possible and not to make them angry and lose viewers. So the science and the acceptance of the science has changed enough so that if you listen to me now compared to 5 years ago, you hear me talking a lot more about the direct connection to climate, not just what happens in Philly, but with the hurricanes or with terrible floods in other parts of the country, or the heat, extreme heat out in the Pacific Northwest. So things that we would not dare talk about 5, 10 years ago are being talked about more. It's just not enough time to get into the detail of it.
Great, yeah, and I suspect there'll be more discussion of it on television as we go forward. We've had several questions here that are related, and I'll try to sum them up. To what extent do Philly's existing zoning regulations help or hinder the changes that are needed? Can zoning be changed to keep development from destroying open space and not paved open space with living soil and plants? Is there any way to replace or paint dark roofs to lessen the effects of heat on buildings? And I think there was another one here. Maybe Julia, that's probably more in your neighborhood as far as, has the water department or others in the city considered asking for changes in the building code to require more permeable space? So the general question is, to what extent can city regulation and city zoning and development be shaped differently?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. And, I mentioned infrastructure-based solutions, but policy-based solutions are going to be really important as well. And that gets to the zoning question, the land use question, development questions. I would say there are several folks in the city talking and working on these issues right now. And that task force I mentioned, the Flood Risk Management Task Force that is citywide, that's the type of forum that we use to discuss how, what changes we think should be pursued in terms of policy. So I don't have any specifics right now on changes we're trying to push at this moment in time, but it is an ongoing area of conversation. And it is definitely recognized, I'd say, at the city level that we need to see policy changes happen in terms of our land use decisions, because that is obviously a major concern with flooding.
Great. Let's move over. Mark, this may be something you could take a try at. Does increased rainfall change water quality in rivers overall, or does it require increased measures in water treatment when we pull water to treat for drinking?
Yes, definitely. I mean, they can overwhelm if the water comes down too much at once, it overwhelms the sewage systems, and you're going to get flushing into rivers of the sewage, and there's just the system can't handle it. So also runoff from in agricultural settings, the water that falls on crops in that can wash pesticides and fertilizers into the river systems that create unnatural conditions, algal blooms and this nature. So too much water all at once on places that already have a lot of chemicals or sewage is a bad thing. And Julia could probably speak to this better than I can.
Oh, that was great, Mark. The only thing I'd add is with those water quality issues, you know, we have to not only think about the impacts from rainfall, but compound impacts from things like increasing air temperature, which also make us more susceptible to algal blooms and other, you know, biological activity that can degrade our source water quality. So, you know, with climate change, it's often, I think a lot of times we compartmentalize the different impacts and say, you know, what are we going to see with more rainfall or more air temperature or higher sea levels? But we also really need to think about what we're going to see when all of those things are happening simultaneously. And that is something we're definitely trying to consider through our climate change adaptation program.
Yeah, and I'll just have to take a second to make a little plug. Our team at the Patrick Center has been working for several years on the Delaware River Watershed Initiative, which is a project funded by William Penn, to really look at how this non-point source pollution, the runoff from pollutes water, and how to come up with ways to lessen that, both in cities and in agricultural areas. So there's about 50 other organizations that are involved in this project. There's a lot of effort being made in that area. So, but it definitely high rain events will increase the amount of runoff and problems with that. I think we have a hand up. Mike, you want to unmute and we can hear from our questioner.
Yeah, great forum. And I just want to say real quickly to Glenn, I want you to talk about that great new book you just put out there, The Weather Maker. And I'm just starting to finally read it. It's a really interesting read.
Do you happen to have a copy of it with you to hold up? Because I don't. It's over in the other part of the newsroom. It's been a little frantic here today with the tornado warnings. So I wrote this book originally like 14 years ago to talk about the potential dangers of trying to fix the climate. And how do you do that? Instead of another nonfiction book that we're talking with the people who are already on your side, you're preaching to the choir about the problem. Oh, he's got it for me. Let's do it in a form of a fiction, of an interesting story, an entertaining story that happens to have the science right. So our slogan is, the story is fiction, the science is real. So you would learn a lot about the latest in climate science. And also, it's kind of a wake-up call about trying to fix the climate. I mean, Bill Gates is talking about this in his new book, and there was controversy about it, throwing stuff up into the atmosphere to bounce the rays of the sun off or put something on the water to reflect. I mean, you're messing with the only planet we have. And so in order to illustrate the potential problems, I wrote this kind of scary story, but tried to keep the science as accurate as possible.
Yeah, I think we've talked about this and you know, sort of balancing out the fear and hope and how you get, you know, action from people without discouraging them too much along that line. Um, a quick question that popped up, and I'm sorry, we've actually had a great number of questions tonight. It's great everyone's asking. I apologize, I'm losing track of some of them here. Uh, Jasmine, just a quick question. They're asked about who are the contacts for nonprofit environmental action groups to coordinate projects with? And I think we all probably know a few of those, but you're the one I think working most on the ground with this kind of thing. Any particular groups you'd name out or encourage people to have contacts with?
Yeah, so with the Tree Philly program, they partner with lots of community development corporations. To see your local CDC, I would recommend going onto the PA CDC website. I'll make sure to link it here for everyone. And that way you can find out which one is specific to your neighborhood. For example, Esperanza boundaries are Hunting Park, Juniata, and Feltonville neighborhoods. So that's kind of the area we service. Impact Services, the Kensington Harrogate neighborhood, as well as New Kensington CDC focuses in the Fishtown area, in addition to East Kensington. So it's going to vary depending on what neighborhood you're in. And that's where usually with the Tree Philly program, they'll at least partner with whatever local CDC is in your area. But I'll link to that, as well as PHS. Everybody should be familiar with Pennsylvania Horticultural Society. They're doing amazing work with the street tree program. And they partner with local organizations, their tree tender groups. I think that was mentioned in the chat earlier, but those are just a few that I can think of right off the top of my head. But I'll definitely link those here in the chat for everyone.
And there's a lot of resources online. I think, you know, you can probably Google your way into some good organizations as well, but definitely start with the ones Jasmine's talking about. Julia, we've had a couple of questions about the possibility of federal funds coming into the city. What ways could the Biden infrastructure plan put us in a better position to respond to climate change? And how would you go about prioritizing programs to use of funding to build resilience to climate change?
Yeah, that's a great question. The city is definitely in the midst of exploring how we can really up our game in terms of applying to federal grants. And the new infrastructure funding, you know, it provides an opportunity for the federal government to provide an influx of funds into not just the maintenance of our infrastructure, which, you know, as I mentioned, it's aging, it's deteriorating. We really need to have funds allocated to maintaining that infrastructure, but they can also support you know, funding community and regional scale risk mitigation efforts. And that can start really at the planning phase. So making sure that we have the means available to, you know, engage with the communities when we're doing all the planning work, that we're bringing the proper experts to the table to come up with the most effective adaptation solutions possible. So there are just a lot of opportunities with federal funding that the city is looking to pursue. So I know that was the first part of the question. Was there a second part there on how to prioritize?
Yeah, how to prioritize.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I can't speak to that broadly for the entire city. From a water department perspective, you know, we are trying to prioritize initiatives for funding based on projects that are shovel ready, so that we have designed and ready to go, and that are in neighborhoods when it comes to flooding, for example, that are extremely vulnerable to flooding today and need to see, you know, infrastructure solutions as soon as possible. And we're also trying to prioritize projects that are more in the planning phase and kind of have a longer term view. So things like climate resilience risk assessments of our different systems, prioritizing which systems are most vulnerable to what climate impacts, and then trying to get funding to do that planning work. And then most importantly, get funding to actually implement projects and solutions. So yeah, just a lot of opportunity there. And I think the city is really hoping to take advantage of that money that will be coming to the city.
Yeah, I think that has a lot of promise to it. Incidentally, the tornado warning has ended for Philadelphia. So Mark, you're probably secure. A couple of questions here that I think are semi-related that Mark or Glenn, either one. Western states have experienced severe drought for several years. Do the heavy rains help us avoid that problem? And in order to keep our reservoirs full, when do we need the rain to get, where do we need the rain to get the most bang for our rain buck? And along a simpler question, along the same line, does anyone know with sea level rise, storm surge, if South Jersey will flood before my house in 17th and Bainbridge? So a question for setting your future planning there. So maybe out west.
So
what's
Roland,
going on?
I checked some of the modeling. It's only going to reach 16th Street.
Okay.
So I think you're okay. Just don't move a block closer.
And I'm going to buy beachfront property in Trenton.
So let me put since we're supposed to be speaking as experts on this and trying to put a scientific ring on it, it sounds like South Jersey is probably going to have a sooner flooding problem than 17th and Bainbridge.
Yeah.
And Julie, I don't know if there's anything in the infrastructure world that changes your thoughts on that or not, but.
No, but I encourage people there are a lot of flood maps available online for, different sea level rise scenarios. One that I'll point people to is a flood map story tool that was developed by the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission that I believe should include, includes all their municipalities that they cover. And it's just a really great interactive tool. So if you want to, I believe you can enter an address and kind of look at flooding risks. There are also lots of other tools through NOAA that allow you to kind of do that, I believe, or at least kind of get an idea of if you're in a high risk area today or in the future. But yeah, a lot of resources online.
Sounds great. And just to get to the question of the relative to the droughts out west, are these heavy rain events going to help us out of that? Is it going to keep the reservoirs filled?
Well, the droughts out west are partly tied to these flooding rains that we have in the east. One like a seesaw. So you get floods in the west, you get droughts in the east. You get floods in the east, you get droughts in the west. You can't get nice weather everywhere. And when you get extreme weather in one part of the country or one part of the world, it's going to affect other parts. Just think about all of the things you've seen on the news in the last week or so with the unbelievable flooding in China, a year's worth of rain in one day. And in London, a month's worth of rain in one day. And in South America, and it's all connected. It's not random, and one thing influences the other. Just one world we got.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
And
I think we have a hand up. Mike, if you want to unmute, please. Richard?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for everybody who's given us some very thoughtful ideas here. I'd like to make sure we don't waste Glenn's sobering analysis. I should note that I've worked with environmental groups for most of my adult life. And I was at one of the first climate change conference for environmental activists that Al Gore called when he was senator back in the 90s. So I've been following it since that time. One of the things that I think is the problem that I keep seeing time after time, and it's causing me to really despair about us really ever getting through this, is that even environmentalists don't think ecologically. And that is, we have not only an environmental problem, climate change, but it's also a political, social, economic problem. Problem is, environmentalists aren't versed in political, historical, social thinking, and so on. So what we do is we keep coming up with reactions after the fact and partial solutions that are not based in the real problem, which is a consumer industrial society dedicated to profit before all else, not people, not the environment. And until we start addressing that, and it has a name, it's called capitalism. And they've got it in China, they've got it in Russia, they've got it in France, we've got it here. It's a society that is profoundly hostile to living in harmony with nature. Matter of fact, it won't do that because it has to use the natural world in order to create profit. It will, as it's done now. We're at a state where the natural world is exhausted because of what we have done to it in the name of profit. So I can't tell you how many meetings and so on I've been to on issues like this. And very seldom do we ever get down to really making an analysis. I forget who it says, some philosopher said, you know, we can entertain the possibility of the end of the world before we entertain the possibility of the end of capitalism. And I'm beginning to agree with them. So
we're a little tight on time, Richard.
Yeah, okay.
I'd like to get everybody.
So I'd like to have people respond to that, because just like Glenn said, at one time he couldn't talk about climate change. Well, today we still can't talk about capitalism. It's too controversial. We're talking about it more, and younger people are. We don't have a lot of time. So any reactions people have to that, give me a little bit of hope for the future here.
I'll take that challenge there. So, and this, I was thinking about this a little earlier. We're probably the only species that thinks we can fix things, and everything else on Earth adapts. They adapt to change, and our species thinks we can fix everything. There's a solution. We can fix it. It doesn't matter that we caused the problem to begin with. We still are so arrogant that we can fix these things. And I think, I don't know, less capitalist thinking and more adaptability. Let's adapt to our natural surroundings is a better frame of mind to carry into the future.
So we are running out of time, and actually that was a great segue, Mark, because I'm going to ask everyone to give their thoughts as to where positive, and I, I'm anyone who knows me knows I'm not always the most positive on this topic, and it can be a little gloomy for all of us, particularly on the science side. But I'd like to hear, and I think Mark was sort of did that with his comment. I'd be interested in hearing folks' thoughts on what are some positive next steps to take. And I think we've heard a little bit of that already. And maybe start, we'll kind of do this in reverse order this time. Glenn, if you want to give us I know you bring up some of that in your slides and your book. What would be in your sort of 1 minute answer to a positive change?
Well, I do have some of those slides. I do want to emphasize the fact that what we're talking about, you hear people say this is the new normal. It's not the new normal. It's the normal for now. 20 years from now, it'll be more extreme. So when we get weather like this, it'll seem like a picnic. So we have to be prepared for that. We have to plan for that. And we have the power to change it to at least some degree. Look at the next slide. The temperatures are going to be going up in the globe. We're all connected here. And what we do, what China does, what Russia does, all influence these global temperatures. And the higher that global temperature goes, the more problems are going to be. The more CO2 goes into the air, the worse it looks. That highest scenario, which was thought of as being, well, not necessarily likely, but a pretty big threat of, has really diminished because there are things being done. There are different types of energy being used and planned. And even in China, they're doing things. So those lower numbers become more likely. I don't think we can keep it at that bottom level at 1.5 degree increase. I would optimistically hope for 2. And this is the next one, kind of sums up the way a lot of the debate goes, where some of the people who don't want to do anything have been saying for years, Oh, it's too soon. We don't know. We need more evidence. We have a short period of history. It's too soon. It's too soon. This happens. It's too soon. And now all of a sudden, oh, it's too late. No matter what we do, it's all going to be a problem. And so throw up our hands and give up. But we're seeing more and more acceptance of this science. We're seeing more and more science that is evolving and that is going to increase the technology and make things better in the future. Where we are now is not where we're going to be 20 years from now. And we can't even think of what's going to be there 20 years from now. But there's a lot of great minds in this world, and there's a lot of interest in trying to deal with this problem. And they're going to start putting money on it. The more disasters you get, the more money is going to be put into trying to either prevent them or minimize them. And that's my hope for the future.
In that kind of a larger, picture, Julia, and then I'll ask Jasmine last on this because we're getting more down into the particulars. Where do you see, sort of from your perspective in the city, Julia, as where these sorts of positive changes can be made or what can be done?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's hard to follow what Glenn just summed up because that really gets to the crux of everything. And, an important point here is we've talked a lot about adaptation, but we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. We need to mitigate the effects of climate change. So we're not needing to adapt to the most severe consequences. That being said, we are locked into a certain amount of climate change. And I think at least at the city level, because climate change is so cross-cutting, this is really an opportunity for us to improve our coordination as a city, as a region on this topic, and to ultimately innovate wherever we can with the goal of improving the quality of life for our residents. Innovation is it's going to be key. And this is a real opportunity to explore solutions and strategies that maybe, aren't traditional, but could be super effective moving forward. Great.
Thanks, Julia. And let me just finish off, Jasmine, because you're the one who is probably the closest to the human impacts of climate change and trying to deal with what are probably the most personal issues people deal with on it. Where do you see the direction and the hope for change on this and from your perspective?
Yeah, I think that we need to be investing in communities that have been affected the most. That's probably the first thing I'll say. In addition to, as we're looking at people like Elon Musk right now and Jeff Bezos who are racing to get to space, but really what we should be investing is in the planet that we currently exist in and live in. And to be quite honest and frank, there needs to be a shift in all of our mentalities around how we're building things. To your point, Julia, thinking about kind of how we include green infrastructure in new builds and things of that nature. But generally that's my perspective on it is invest in our planet, invest in our local communities, and ensure that they're healthy first before we worry ourselves with what's going on in space and other places. And I say that jokingly as well, but there is some seriousness to that, right? We can't continue living this way. And living in one of the most extremely hot neighborhoods in Philadelphia, I can speak to the fact that we just really need to be investing in our neighborhoods and in our city if we want to see some changes happening.
Great, thanks. I didn't mean to pass you over, Mark. Have you had anything to add to the comments you had before?
I was just writing in the chat. If you look on Google Maps of the city of Philadelphia, you're going to see a large urban landscape dissected by these green squiggly lines. And each one of those lines follows a creek or a river that's well forested and just beautiful. And, visit these areas, use these areas. They're full of trails. They're wonderful places to use to kind of escape lots of things. And it could help you appreciate more the natural systems that are at work, even in a highly urbanized setting like Philadelphia.
Great. And don't forget to come to museums like us to get an idea of how natural systems work. It's just been really great. As always, we could probably continue for another hour. Really appreciate everyone, our panelists, all of you for joining us. all the folks here. Again, please stop by the Academy, check out our climate year stuff. We'll be having another Town Square program, I think, Mike, later in the summer, and we'll be doing a couple more on climate. So please get in touch with us. Thank you all again for joining us, and look forward to seeing you at the next Academy event.